Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. Very excited to have this webinar, which discusses a very important topic. So the title of the webinar is Rethink Industrial Policy to Increase Exports. And this is a really important topic given where we are as a country. Just by way of background, since the beginning of 2024, CDE has been collaborating with a range of experts in our community, ranging from business leaders, former public servants, lawyers, and various other people, in an initiative that is called Agenda 2024, Priorities for South Africa's New Government. So this project sets out to answer what is by far the most important question facing our country, and that is, what can our new government do to get our country back on track after the many years, 15 years or so of stagnation and decline. So Agenda 2024 is really focused on 5 areas which CDE has identified, in which there are critical actions to kickstart fundamental reforms in the South African economy. So today we are focusing on driving growth and development by freeing markets and competition. So CDE has published 6 other reports, in this series, but today we are launching the 7th report in the series, and the report is Rethink Industrial Policy to Increase Exports. So we will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end and be able to interact with the panel of speakers that I have for you today, and I will introduce them shortly. My name is Khulekani Mathe. I am the CEO designate at Business Unity South Africa and an associate of CDE. So welcome to this webinar. So to take us through this report that I have just introduced, CDE Executive Director Ann Bernstein will give a report, a short presentation, just outlining some of the key issues, key recommendations from the report. And this will be followed by a panel discussion from 3 excellent panelists whom I will introduce. One and have started or finished actually her presentation. For now, I would just like to assure you that we will keep enough time in the back to allow you to interact with the panelists and ask questions, which I will ask you to do in the chat. So if you can write your questions in the chat, we will then be able to ask those questions. If you can direct your questions to a specific panel member, please do so. If you can't, we will put it to all of them and see who wants to take it on. So without wasting any more time, welcome again, and let me hand over to Ann Bernstein, the Executive Director of CDE. Ann, over to you.
Thank you very much, Khulekani. I'm going to share some slides. You'll just bear with me. Great. Well, as Khulekani said, everyone, good morning. This is our 7th report, and up till now, we've been focusing on 3 different areas. The first is to rebuild and refocus the state. The second is tackling the fiscal crisis. And the third has been 2 reports on strengthening the rule of law to reduce corruption and crime and strengthen law enforcement, without which we're not going to get a growing economy. Today, we're going to look at catalytic actions we think need to take place with respect to the Department of Trade, Industry and Cooperation. So what are the headlines of my presentation today and the report we're releasing? South Africa's manufacturing has declined much faster than almost all comparable countries. We are going to argue that a fundamental rethink is required. Localization is not a growth strategy. There are big challenges facing our largest industrial subsidization program, the auto program, and tariff reform is essential. In our view, we should focus on expanding exports, and we should remove the obstacles to making this country a much easier place, a much lower cost place in which to do business. And we're going to talk about a new role for the department. Now, this report looks at the core activities for which the DTIC is responsible. It therefore focuses on policies relating to trade, industry, and competition. And we then suggest reforms in all three areas. On industrial policies, we have focused mostly on the department's master plans, the key DTIC strategy. The SEZ program, the Special Economic Zones, is a key part of this department's work, but we will deal with that in a separate report, which is forthcoming in January. So everybody knows there's something wrong. In July 2024, in his opening of the new Parliament post the elections, President Ramaphosa called for smart industrial policy focused on competitiveness and incentivizing businesses to expand exports. He also called for a reassessment of master plans, asking, are they as effective as we had envisaged? A few months later, NEDLAC issued a major report on 30 years of democracy and what the GNU should be thinking about. And they said, we need a comprehensive review of South Africa's trade and competition policies. Most master plans have either failed or achieved slow progress. And then this year, the Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies think tank, very close to the DTIC, did a review of the master plans. And they said they only apply to a very small fraction of the economy. They have had little impact. They have done nothing to raise the level of manufactured exports. And they also could divert attention and resources away from larger scale initiatives that could be more inclusive of all those people left out of our modern economy. So we are saying the GNU and a new minister in this department provides a real opportunity to rethink a critical part of the policies affecting our economy. Now, sadly, South Africa's performance has been really bad. Now, it's true that manufacturing is a declining sector globally, but South Africa should do better. Manufacturing declined as a percentage of GDP and as an employer. In the period 1960 to 2023, manufacturing fell from some 20% of GDP to under 13%. Employment declined. from 1.8 million in 2001 to less than 1.6 million in 2023. We've done worse than other countries. So we're one of only a few countries with an overall loss of manufacturing jobs. The number of exporting firms is falling. In 2015, we had 42,000 firms that exported manufactured goods. In 2022, the figure was under 36,000. Now, there are many reasons for failure, but a key one is the DTIC's policy choices. What are these? Well, more and more items are subject to duties and higher average tariffs. Government agencies are required to purchase a wide range of designated products solely or predominantly from domestic firms. NEDLAC, in an agreement in 2023, they agreed to try and reduce the value of South Africa's non-oil imports by 20% over the next 5 years. Public interest interventions in mergers and acquisitions to promote various industrial policy goals, such as employment and especially transformation. That has been the focus rather than more investment, more exports. And then there's subsidies to firms in key sectors, especially vehicles. As you can see, the whole focus of the department's approach has been to protect local firms. Now, some manufacturing firms have struggled in the face of cheaper imports, but the DTIC response to protect local firms from foreign competition actually makes things worse. If you protect South African firms behind tariff barriers, they might hold on to market share in the country, but they lose the incentive to become more productive and more efficient. And because foreign firms continue to become more productive, South African firms fall further and further behind. On top of that, global value chains in the 21st century are highly sophisticated, and firms that participate in them are highly specialized. Protectionism prevents South African firms from accessing new technology and specializing and finding their particular niche in global value chains. So we would argue that talking about promoting exports in a context of expanding protectionism is at best like walking up a down escalator. The two ambitions contradict each other. Now, there's a high cost to protecting incumbents. If you have to force government to buy local, there's a reason. Either the products that we are producing are too expensive or low quality, or they're just not exactly what the government department or particular firms want. Raising the price of protected goods has negative consequences. So the cost of forcing state-owned enterprises, for example, to use only South African-made goods can be very high. A former CEO of Eskom estimated that the distribution network cost 2.5 times the equivalent cost in Namibia. That means we end up with less infrastructure and less government-produced goods and services. By protecting some firms and allowing them to produce at higher than global market prices, you end up by raising the costs of imports, which are needed by South African firms in many ways, and also if they want to export. Consumers have to pay more. Downstream industries face higher costs, fewer opportunities, and overall there's less growth and fewer jobs. What happens then is you end up benefiting the few who are directly linked to the firms that enjoy higher prices, but this is at the cost of everyone else. Now, in our view, master plans are the wrong approach for South Africa, and they have essentially not worked. This has been an approach based on sectors and a top-down kind of approach. And we would argue, why only sectors? There are value chains, there are all sorts of other things. So firms in a dairy processing value chain may want to organize to expand exports across many different sectors. Or small firms in one sector may have much more in common with small firms in another sector. All firms in Johannesburg may have common needs that firms in Cape Town or Durban do not have. The fact is that the DTIC has limited powers. They can't deliver big improvements, fixing electricity or Transnet and logistics or labor regulations, but they can deliver import duties. There is a bias in the master plans which favor incumbents, especially those with the loudest voices. So TIPS found that master plans have led to protection, but no improvement in export performance. Let me turn now to competition policy. And here we would argue we've got diverted from the essence of what is required. Well-functioning competitive markets allow the entry of new firms. And that's important for a country like ours wanting to transform who can participate in our economy. The competition authorities must ensure that existing firms do not engage in anti-competitive conduct. But under the previous minister, competition policy became focused on merger regulations and deals with the parties to transactions mainly about employment and transformation. So there's been micromanagement of transactions, but seeking industrial policy goals, not the goals of competition policy. Lots of deals with the minister. This introduces policy-driven discretion and uncertainty. And what it does, in our views, it's had little impact on the economy, takes lots and lots of time, and it discourages investment. So what are our recommendations for what should be done now? The first is that in a small economy like South Africa's, we need to focus on exports. Global markets will create opportunities for this economy to grow, for our existing firms to expand, for new firms to find new niches in the global economy. Competitive firms that can trade globally will have access to much larger markets. As a result, they will be able to turn their productivity gains into substantially larger sales, permitting firms to grow and to create additional jobs. They need to access value chains, but that means they've got to have access to all the latest technology and innovative ideas, and then they in turn can learn and grow. In our view, competitiveness has to be the main, if not the only, criteria. It's only competition, including competition from foreign firms, that is a reliable force for ensuring that firms are competitive, which is why protectionism is so very debilitating. It creates incentives that make it less likely that South African firms will focus on export markets. And to access global markets, South African firms must learn to compete with firms in other countries. There's just no alternative to that. The process of doing all of this will lower costs and expand opportunities. So we are saying the GNU must focus on making it easier to do business in South Africa, lower the cost of doing business, lower the hassle. And in this way, we can promote more exports, which is something that everybody wants, and make our own firms much more productive. So lowering the cost of doing business has to be the key focus of the DTIC, and in our view, the whole 7th administration in South Africa. Our second recommendation is to reform the tariff system. We should immediately eliminate all tariffs on goods not made by South African firms. We should review tariffs more frequently and build in sunset clauses. Decisions to extend or amend existing tariffs must consider the impact of tariffs on prices faced both by consumers and downstream users of the protected good. The assessment of tariff requests must give weight to all the costs of protection. So you've got to consider the cost on users and not just the benefit to protected firms. Our third recommendation, let's get back to the basics on competition policy, a very important ambition and goal. We have to restrict micromanagement and discretionary goals, return competition policy to its foundations. What are they? It's to make sure that firms do not engage in anti-competitive conduct intended to restrict or distort markets. And we've got to strengthen the capacity of both the Competition Commission and the Tribunal. Our fourth recommendation is that we need an external review of the automotive program. Now, the automotive program is the DTIC's largest industrial subsidy program. It's the largest in the country. We spend 35 billion rand per annum on this directly, and the costs to the economy include further tens of billions every year in higher vehicle costs. The 2008 review, which was the last one done, concluded that this program was a net drain on the economy. And we would argue it's time that the program is assessed again. This assessment, well, let me say, this assessment has to take account of the challenging new world that we live in. Chinese automobiles are flooding South Africa and global markets. there is enormous pressure to change towards electric vehicles. And they're going to be in the markets where we supply cars, as well as in South Africa. So the review we're calling for has to understand all the costs and all the benefits. It needs to be independent, but have auto industry representation. And it must take sunk costs and commitments into account. So it is really important that the review should consult with and have representation from the auto sector, but the auto sector must not control this review. External and independent. Our fifth recommendation is to replace master plans with productivity councils. Let's shift from protectionism, which is an inherent bias in most master plans, to competitiveness. We need a bottom-up approach. Groups of firms should be getting together and saying, we want to establish a productivity council to focus on whatever the firms decide. We need to think a lot more about value chains rather than always sectors. And we need to focus very hard on reducing costs. We've got to adopt and employ new technologies effectively. We have to address the obstacles in the South African administrative and logistical environment that increase costs. So we've got to address real red tape, and we should all be honest what that is, and unnecessary standards. We've got to look at infrastructure deficiencies, at labor markets, at investment finance, and much more. By focusing on productivity, the goal moves from protecting the status quo with master plans to encouraging change and improvements in the whole economy. Our last recommendation is a more active role for the DTIC. In our view, they should stop micromanaging firms and sectors. They should focus instead on creating a better environment in which to do business. Now, this is an important role to work closely with other departments, economic clusters in the cabinet, and local governments. The DTIC should seek to shape the debate to ensure other departments do everything they can do to promote the expansion of business. So their key role is to promote the role of business and competitive markets, both in government and in the public debate as well. Let me conclude then. Everybody wants growth. Nobody wants to change. The DTIC is responsible for a critical set of components in our overall growth strategy. More of the same policies will get us the same bad results. Protection will not lead to fast or inclusive growth. An export-ready economy will help all firms. In many ways, South Africa spends far too much time protecting the firms that we have. We now need to spend much more attention on how we get more firms, new firms, expanding firms. The GNU creates an opportunity to change the country's direction and prospects. We are therefore calling for an overhaul of industrial policy to move it away from protectionism and towards a focus on growing exports. A new approach to master plans, tariff setting, and competition policy is, in our view, urgently required. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Anne, and a round of applause, everybody. It does not get more provocative than that, and in a way that only Anne can make it. So thank you very much, Anne, for those really provocative remarks about some of our holy cows in the policy space in South Africa. Scanning through the list of attendants, I saw many people who have played a role in one form or another in different aspects of our competition policy, industrial policy, and trade policy, who I have no doubt want to engage with you. But before we get to the questions that are coming through, and I do want to encourage everybody to put your questions down on the Q&A so that we can put them to Anne and the other panelists. But before we get there, I have an excellent panel that will help us work through some of these provocative remarks by Anne. First up is Lawrence Edwards, who is Professor of Economics at the University of Cape Town. Over to you, Lawrence.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen while I can. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this. I think it's a very interesting discussion. I think it's many very interesting issues that Anne has raised, and I'm not 100% sure I have that much more to add to what Anne has said. And I probably won't say it as succinctly and cleanly, but I'm going to try and keep this within my certain short time limit. I want to quickly emphasize one of the key challenges and constraints that we're facing, and that is actually the really poor performance on exports. And in this diagram here, I'm just plotting South Africa's export performance, our real exports to GDP, and that's the green line, and comparing that against what the average is for an upper middle income country. And the striking point here is the divergence in the trends. That's the first key point. The second key point really is that South Africa's trend is downward sloping, and the implication really is telling us that exports are not leading growth, they are a drag on growth. Real exports are growing slower than the rest of the economy. In effect, this is the opposite of export-led growth. And this is a real crisis in terms of export performance. If we look even more within subdivisions, Anne has spoken quite clearly about these, across all metrics, when you unpack these metrics, South Africa is experiencing declining export performance, exporters from exporting, declining in number of products with comparative advantage, very high and rising concentration of exports amongst very few firms, very little transition from small firms into becoming big firms, continued dominance of minerals and metals in our exports, very low survival rate or declining survival rates, and this declining sophistication and complexity of exports. And further, which is underreported, is an underperformance of services exports. Now, of course, this is a big aggregate picture. At the sub-level, we see lots of exceptions. We're a world leader in exports of catamaran boats. We increase our exports of avos. Citrus has been a real bonus. We've grown phenomenally. Even automotive exports have grown, although those have slowed recently. Our exports of sub-Saharan Africa have also been relatively strong, although these are primarily small exports. But nevertheless, the aggregate picture is one of real export crisis. And so what are the implications? And some of the key thoughts around this particular point is the argument I would make is really saying we need to rethink this industrial policy and reshift it away very strongly towards expanding exports. Currently, as Anne was pointing, much of our focus is through reindustrialization or industrialization through localization. But when we look at the data and when we think carefully about our deindustrialization problem does not arise from a failure to localize. In effect, it arises from a failure to export. And the domestic market is simply too small. And this is actually recognized. Minister Tau spoke about the imperative of improving exports, and he emphasizes that the domestic market is simply too small. And the real implication of that is if we direct policy towards reindustrializing through localization and through creating industries that supply the local market, in effect, we're trapping our industrial structure towards supplying a small and slow-growing domestic market. These firms are facing international competition and facing international productivity improvements. And the broad implication then is the growth of the domestic market is not going to be sufficient to offset the loss in jobs from improved productivity. And so actually localization will accelerate the deindustrialization of the domestic economy rather than reverse the trend. The way to do this, I think, would be to argue to shift the economy towards exports. We have a large external market where productivity improvements in the domestic firms can lead to expansion of output through a large international market. And that, I think, will help reverse the deindustrialization or slow the deindustrialization process down. Behind this, though, I think, is a real fundamental change in how we think about imports. Currently, there's a large resistance to importing. Imports are the bad. But actually, if we're going to export, we need a very open trade policy whereby firms can freely import. And when we look at the data, what we see is that exporters are highly dependent on imports. Participants in GVCs have been a global value chains, have been a key driver of global export performance. Those exporters require access to international produced intermediate inputs. More than just inputs, they require access to technology through in-licensing, through technology embodied in imports, and so on. And they need low costs, which is attainable through cheaper access to international inputs. So imports are a critical feature of any export growth strategy, and increasing access to imports is critically important. And that really raises some key issues when you think about it, and that is trade costs. And this links to ports, it links to all factors affecting trade costs, import tariffs, etc. And the critical feature for exporters is they're taxed twice. They're taxed twice, firstly, on access to the critical intermediate inputs, as it's expensive to get through the South African ports. And then they're taxed secondly when they try and get their goods out the international port as well. So it's a real cost to exporters of having high trade costs, of which South Africa is characterized by. And I want to point out one actually additional insight relating to this is it's really a tax on labor, because the only way we can compete still internationally is we have to cut our costs somewhere. And the only way we can cut our costs in many cases is cutting the costs and the labor that we can afford to pay. And in a way, this is a tax on low wage opportunities. We can't compete in low wage exporting because the trade costs are very high, and hence we preclude access to a whole range of firms into the international market because of these high trade costs that are associated with exporting and importing. The third key issue I wanted to suggest was we should really rethink our focus of industrial policy away from the strong emphasis on sectors. Sectors matter, but we should place greater emphasis on horizontal policies. As Ann pointed out, exporters are not key constraints exporters face are not primarily or always driven by sector-specific constraints. These are common constraints. The ports is a common access, and the high cost of ports is a common constraint across all firms that are trying to export. It's not a sector-specific problem in essence. And this has become increasingly important with fragmentation of production, where in global value chains, it's not the sector that matters, it's the task that matters. And the task is independent of the sector. And so we really need to think about dealing with the constraints to competitiveness, not along the sector lines, but across these factors that are common affecting all firms. And these are cross-cutting issues like how do we improve productivity, cheap and efficient logistics, improving foreign investment, skills. We have SETAs, which are sector-driven approaches. And these are not well placed, I argue, to deal with import competition, challenges of exporters across the board. Then thinking about master plans and industrial policy, a key shift in industrial policy globally is the emphasis on coordination roles, the role that the government can play, or institutions like the DTIC can play in coordinating between state, business and labor, and consumers, I should add. And there I really think the master plans are a good opportunity, and Anne's spoken at length around this particular point. And I would argue is the objective of these should reshift towards driving exports. Anne says driving productivity. I think that's a good point. But I think we should also rethink about how we use these institutions to drive exports as a key outcome, rather than negotiating a trade-off between protection, investment, etc., as I think they're currently doing. Two other quick points. A simpler, more coherent trade policy. Donald McKay, I think, will deal a lot with the internal dimension of trade policy, but I think we also need to rethink our external dimension. And there are discussions within the DTIC around this. We need to be bold and less defensive around trade agreements. On the multilateral side, I'm not sure much is going to happen. but at least on the preferential side, we have great scope to expand our range of agreements in accessing foreign markets. Not through the partial scope agreements like the Mercosur one, which are really empty in content, but through deeper integration plans or trade agreements that also include services. We can also, even though WTO is not functioning so well, we can engage in the plurilateral discussions on e-commerce. We're not participating in these. We're left out of those discussions. And very importantly, I think increasingly with this global rise in protectionism, non-trade barriers is the key role that government-to-government negotiations play in dealing with foreign barriers. The negotiations in terms of getting access of AVOs into China is an excellent example of a critical role that the DTIC will increasingly play, I think, in this global trade environment that we're moving. The final point is to stop ignoring services. I mean, services are increasingly recognized as a key source of productivity growth. The growth without smokestacks is a term that is commonly used. And so my argument would be is in many cases we ignoring the role that services could play in both driving industrialization, but also in terms of driving export growth, particularly in relation to digital services trade, which is a big opportunity for economies. And linked to that is a much stronger emphasis on trying to incorporate services trade agreements into our existing trade agreements and into the new trade agreements. This is happening under the AFCFTA, which is a great initiative, but we can be bolder with respect to some of the other agreements as well. I think these are some of the key points that build on, I think, what Ann has discussed already. Thank you.
Thanks, Sir Lawrence, Edward. That's a really excellent insights, and we can pick up on them as we respond to some of the questions on the chat line. Now, next up is Liberty Mncube, who is MD for Berkeley Research Group, Associate Professor of Economics at Wits University. He is former Deputy Chair of the Competition Tribunal and the former Chief Economist of the Competition Commission. So over to you, Mr. Mncube.
Thank you for the introduction, Khulekani, and it is my privilege to be here with my fellow panelists. Too often, the public policy debates are driven by clashes in ideology and opinion than being driven by reliable information and analysis. And recently, competition policy debates have tended to follow this trend. So thank you to Ann and the CDE for hosting the event. I think it's an important feature of our society to periodically reevaluate and debate the direction of government policy. And it all just leads to a healthy dialogue, which of course leads to positive outcomes and improvements in policy. So before suggesting 4 choices on competition policy as an instrument in industrial strategy that the new government could consider to help the whole of South African economy grow productively and sustainably, I would want to restate the economic problem. So the economic problem relates to excessive market power. Excessive market power increases prices and reduces output and choices for consumers, depresses wages for workers, retards innovation, and retards the ability of businesses to thrive. Whereas the poor, with the least ability to avoid its consequences, suffer more and more. And what it does is that you exacerbate inequality and poverty. So 3 institutions, the Competition Commission, the Tribunal, and the Competition Appeal Court, have exclusive jurisdiction on competition issues. The Commission is the prosecutor in the system. The Tribunal acts like a court of first instance, and the Competition Appeal Court reviews the decisions of the Tribunal. Understanding the roles of these institutions becomes important and critical to any debate about competition law enforcement. With that said, I think I want to spend a few minutes commenting about the South African competition law enforcement system in promoting productivity and what factors determine this. The first factor is, of course, the doctrines that the Tribunal and the Appeal Court develop. A decision of the Tribunal or the Appeal Court can expand or limit the reach of competition law. Similarly, a prosecutorial decision by the Commission as an enforcer in the system can also expand or limit the reach of competition law. Importantly, if you consider these two factors just discussed, a change in the Commission's enforcement discretion or a change in a decision of the tribunal, this can lead to increased or reduced enforcement. The third factor I want to talk about is just the fiscal resources available to competition authorities. It is sometimes difficult to disentangle the role of these factors. So when you have inadequate resources provided to the tribunal, for example, this reduces the number of cases that can be heard or decided, leading to a protracted litigation, and this leads to costs for parties, particularly for small firms. So when you look at the budgets provided to the Competition Commission and the tribunal first, over the last 25 years, the tribunal's budget has only doubled in real terms, while the Commission's grant has grown tenfold. The tribunal only has 6 members. In 2000, it had 10 tribunal members. Members decide cases. So when you have a shortfall in resources provided to the tribunal, this means that you'll have delays in hearing cases, delays in handling decisions, and giving orders. So increasing or decreasing the grant provided to the tribunal affects both the degree of competition of enforcement and its impact. Now I want to talk about major regulation, which preoccupies the debate about the direction of competition law enforcement. I'm going to make 3 observations around major control. First, consider the ratio of the number of major actions. So major actions are where a measure is approved with conditions or it's prohibited, to the number of major filings. So the number of businesses coming up to say we have deals. This gives you a ratio of the major enforcement rate. The major enforcement rate increased from about 2% in 2010 to about 50% in 2024, which means that today, 1 in 2 measures is approved with conditions. Very few measures are ultimately prohibited, but this rate is quite high. And this statistic on its own may shed little about whether the enforcement is adequate, but it does suggest a number of ways that we should start thinking about whether what we are doing in measures is appropriate. The second observation I want to make is relates to the recently published public interest measure guidelines by the Commission. The guidelines are, of course, not binding to the tribunal or the appeal court, but serve to state the Commission's approach in measure control. There's been quite a lot of debate around the guidelines. And to illustrate this debate, consider a deal that involves an institutional investor based in the UK buying a local black-owned firm. The transaction is intended to grow the acquired firm's business in South Africa and will create jobs, resulting in positive outcomes. At first glance, the transaction will have a negative effect on the public interest factor relating to the promotion of a greater spread of ownership. On this example, and using the Commission's guidelines, the Commission would require remedies. The question, though, is such a requirement appropriate? So the Commission's approach seems to suggest that parties filing deals in South Africa have a positive obligation to promote a greater spread of ownership. It is important to note that the Commission's approach is at war with the guidance of the tribunal or the appeal court regarding what is to be done in relation to how one considers the assessment on public interest. Surprisingly, though, major parties have not to date asked the tribunal to reconsider a decision of the Commission which applies its guidance. Instead, they've chosen to bargain with the Commission and present the bargained agreement as a condition to the merger. While the Commission has broad discretion to determine which cases and how it pursues its cases, flawed and untested legal and economic reasoning creates a daunting task for firms wanting to do deals in South Africa. The resulting harm goes beyond the effects on individual cases to chilling competition and chilling investment. So none of this is what the Competition Act intended, and I am particularly concerned about this. However, for me, the cue does not lie in further legislative direction, but in judicial interpretations of the Act coming from the tribunal or from the appeal court, which are meant to define the scope and the limits of major regulation, and which are meant to set the boundaries for the Commission's work. Let me just turn quickly to what I think are the 4 choices that the new GNU must consider. So the first one is they should support a competition agenda by devoting more resources to competition law adjudication. The second is the competition system currently designed leads to protracted merger reviews. So one institutional improvement that could be considered is to make the Commission the decision maker in all mergers, and then appeals will go to the tribunal. The proceedings before the tribunal would remain informal, expeditious as circumstances and considerations of fairness permit. The third would be to consider combining competition policy with consumer protection policy. They both share the same goal in terms of protecting consumers. This would mean you create one institution that deals with both, and the powers of that one institution would then be used flexibly in an integrated way to help consumers. The last factor that the last point that I want to make is that the GNU should not leave competition policy solely to the DTIC, but should be competition policy, protecting it, promoting it, should be a whole of government priority. I think the above reforms require legislative support, and I'm under no illusion of the difficulty of passing legislation, but there is an opportunity now with the GNU to pass meaningful legislation that will support competition, because we can only grow productively and inclusively if we have effective competition in markets, and markets work for all. Thank you, Khulekani. I hope I did not exceed my time.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Professor Mngwe. Again, excellent additions to the points or perspectives on the points made by Ann earlier. Next up is Donald Mathe, who is CEO of XA Trade Advisory. Over to you, Donald. Unmute yourself, Donald.
My apologies. I've clearly learned nothing from our time during COVID. My apologies. Let me reshare. All right, morning everyone. My apologies for the little technology stutter. I concur with all of the previous speakers. In fact, maybe just to add a comment to what Liberty said, a part of the reason why the economy remains as concentrated as it is what happens on the trade policy side is a consistent trend to providing protection to large, highly concentrated sectors. So somewhere in the order of about 30% of all the anti-dumping cases that have been brought in the last 20 years were brought by 5 companies, and 4 of those companies are monopolies, and 4 of those companies are more than 100 years old. So that's just perhaps to add to that. All right, if we get to the master plans very quickly, the intention behind the master plans is kind of a mini NEDLAC for an industry. The master plans bring government, labor, and business together, which is good. But what we find is not a single one of the plans make meaningful contributions to making industries more competitive. And we see this, just agreeing with Ann from earlier, competitiveness is at the heart of what will either make South Africa's economy succeed or fail. If you have a look at this model over here that we use to kind of just demonstrate the thinking around industrial policy, the blue bits at the bottom of the pyramid are those areas which drive up the competitiveness of a country that make it attractive to invest in. And the two bits at the top, picking winners, whether by way of sectors or companies, typically leads to disaster. We cannot find a single one of the master plans in South Africa that has had a noticeable positive impact, with the possible exclusion of the automotive plan. But if you took away the 35 billion a year and the more expensive cars in South Africa, that would rapidly disappear, I believe. So part of the problem with the master plans is we have an insane number of objectives. So we did a count up. We've got something in the order of about 30 different objectives between the master plans. But really, the objective that matters, because all of the actions in the plans really center around point number 3, which is localization and import substitution. And what we find is, rather than there being 7 objectives, there's one objective, and the thinking is, if you achieve that, the others will in some way flow. So the actions in the plans are very heavily focused on the import substitution. You'll get throwaway comments about how if we do this, companies will become more competitive, but it's never clear to me how that statement holds up in reality. Nevertheless, we do have some quick fixes. So there are a couple of procedural things which I think with the fix can make an enormous difference, even if we relabel what these things are called. But we need appointments to these master plan committees to be made by industry and not the minister. So defining characteristic of what happened is a group of people put into a room, very often larger businesses, and formulating plans for the sector. This is not a transparent process. There are no minutes kept of these meetings. Nobody can attend, even just to observe. And in this environment, a lot of very dark things begin happening. And I think if whatever we do here, we've got to have a process which doesn't encourage bad behavior. Clear targets have got to be set and measured. We don't see this happening. And even when the targets are set, when they're not achieved, then they just reset and pushed out. But importantly, we would like to see these master plan committees used to remove hurdles. So very often, the single biggest problems that companies identify has some link to government. The ports are broken, there's no railway lines anymore, whatever it might be, no electricity and so on. But what happens then is the master plans, instead of focusing on what those hurdles might be, and some of them are not quite as significant as that, what instead happens is a conversation around how the sector can be compensated for the failings. And the compensation is usually in the form of some or other protectionist measure. And so the problem with this is that we're sitting with a small number of companies which tend to dominate our economy, able to lobby for regulatory changes that benefit them in a secret environment. And then we're expecting competitive sectors to emerge. The process significantly favors large companies rather than small. And so many of the plans, again, drive home the benefit to this very, very small group of successful lobbyists that get into the room, while much of the industry very often doesn't even know there is a room that they could be in. I've noted before, there's an obsessive focus on import replacement. I mean, this is an industrial policy approach. It's been discredited an eternity ago, but this still sits at the heart of everything. And I think part of the reason for that is it's a politically cheap option. To become competitive forces some very difficult conversations around a lot of the policies which look a lot like sacred cows. So extremely high levels of union involvement in certain sectors to a point where they completely dominate, making certain sectors quite uncompetitive. conversations that we can't have about the empowerment policies we have and what works about them and what doesn't. And those are the things which ultimately are the conversations around productivity and competitiveness. It is, however, much easier for government to say, look, what we'll do is we'll just get the consumer to pay a little bit more. It's not really a big problem. They only pay a small amount more each. And that river of money flows into the pockets then of a very small number of companies. And again, further concentrating the economy, lowering levels of innovation, etc. We need predictable processes. We should not be in a position where a company goes to government and says, I need this raw material, I can't buy it locally, please remove the duty. And the investigation takes years. They're forced to sign away a kidney to get the concession. And this, by the way, is the way of things at the moment. And perhaps to just quickly demonstrate this, a tariff investigation, just a normal tariff investigation, is meant to take 6 months. And we know this because you can download the policy off of ITAC's website. At present, that average sits at about 27 months. Just recently, there was an investigation into solar panels that took 63 months to complete. It's very hard to see how anyone benefits from a process taking over 5 years to reach a conclusion. But yet this is now the norm, not the exception anymore. If you look at the chart in front of you, the bar chart shows 6-month periods for the last 20 years. And at the end of each 6 months, on average, how long all of those cases had been open for. And if you take the line at the top, that is in every 6-month period, how long the oldest case had been open for. And this is catastrophic. We see companies have just disengaged from this process completely, because if you're told, I've got an urgent problem, and you're told to wait 5 years before someone will get back to you, that's obviously very bad. So this process has to be absolutely reformed. Just a final comment, and this is my last. There's an enormous opportunity here because duties are not reviewed. When they go in, they kind of tend to just stay there for an eternity. So 93% of all duties which are currently in place have been in place for more than 20 years without a review. So there's billions of rands being paid in duties on product that nobody even knows if it is being produced locally. And this certainly should present an opportunity to put some money back into the pockets of consumers, or at least take a conscious decision to keep the duty based on data. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Donald. Again, you did not disappoint in really just helping the focus on what are some of the things we need to look at when it comes to our industrial and trade policy. There's clearly a lot of weaknesses in our policy that asks us as South African consumers to pay more because of lack of competitiveness. That doesn't sit well with me. And I'm pretty sure it doesn't sit well with many others. And some suggestions have been offered for how we can improve things in the South African economy. There is a raging debate, discussion in the Q&A section where people are putting across different views in response to this really excellent presentation, excellent discussion by the respondents. And so we'll take a couple of questions. We won't be able to go through all of the questions here. I am hoping that the organizers will be able to find a way of either responding to people, on the chat line as it is, but we'll pick a few and ask our panelists to respond to. So, the first question by Zinzile Kajana, she says that, and I'm not going to read the preamble, but I'll go straight to the question. How can industrial policy balance short-term export goals with long-term sustainability? And the second one is, what role do public-private partnerships play in driving export growth? I'm going to ask Professor Lawrence Edwards to take the first question, and then ask Anne if you want to tackle the second question, and then we'll go to the next set of questions. Professor Edwards.
Thanks. So I'm not 100% sure what the issue is, what is meant here by long-term sustainability, but maybe I'll talk what I would think long-term sustainability is. Long-term sustainability is a competitive economy that can grow and that can expand. And in the context of manufacturing, it's a manufacturing industry that can grow and expand and survive. Our current context is we're not in a long-term sustainable situation with respect to manufacturing, which is declining in importance in employment and in terms of GDP. So this links to the story about exports. And so that's the emphasis on exports is one strategy or aspect of the strategy to enable the sustainability or long-term sustainability, at least of the manufacturing sector. But that talks to this discussion here. Now, I think the issue about short-term issues is a critical one because adjustments take a long time, and investments require confidence in the future of the economy and confidence in the future of the policies. And then investments take a long time to gestate to get to point. So there's a long-term transition point to restructure an economy towards export orientation. And that, I mean, thinks we have to think carefully about how we deal with existing policies or how we phase out of existing policies. I would not argue that you want a radical and sudden reduction in tariffs, for example. Firms need time to adjust, and you need to phase out those processes or phase out tariffs where they're no longer needed, or they're encouraging domestic firms to focus internally versus encouraging them to focus externally in that. And so it's a real process of adjustment, a sustainable adjustment, rather than quick curtailed cuts in tariffs, for example, which is a shock and a strong negative shock, and so on. So I think exports is a long-term goal. It's not a short-term goal in relation to that question, and it needs long-term planning and implementation of these policies. Yeah. So let me stop there.
Yeah. No. Thanks. And do you want to tackle the second question?
Sorry, I'm not clear what the second question was, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so let me read it out, and if you want to give it a pass, we'll see if the two panelists want to take it. So it says, what role do public-private partnerships play in driving export growth?
Yeah, I think I'm going to give this over to the panel. I'm not sure exactly what it's meant.
No, that's fine. Is anybody in the other panelists who wants to try and tackle this question? If not, we'll move on to the next set of questions. Going once, going twice. Okay, let's move on, and maybe the person who raised the question, if you want to just say a little bit more so the panel can understand what you have in mind with this question as we move on. So Tipepo asks questions. He says, looking at what Indonesia has done with critical raw minerals, localization seems to be working. Is this not a path for us? Secondly, is the looming era of Trump and tariffs, in the looming era of Trump and tariffs, do we not need to be smarter rather than totally eliminating them? Okay, who wants to take the first one about the localization, learning from the Indonesian experience?
I could do that if you like.
I think, Jonathan, I was going to point it to you. Go ahead.
So I'm not sure that's a great example, but Indonesia have had a couple of attempts at this. For example, they put a ban on palm oil a couple of years ago, the exports of palm oil. And they said we have to beneficiate it locally. The impact of that was very, very interesting. The global price of palm oil rose, but the price inside of Indonesia completely collapsed. There were all kinds of problems that arose with the banks that had been financing these producers. So the consequences were quite severe, and they've had to ease up on that. We've done something similar with nickel now. The only way that that sort of strategy works is if you're completely dominant in a particular material and you don't have competition. So when South Africa, for example, pondered the idea of imposing an export duty on chrome ore, it didn't go through. But what was interesting is we're the largest producer of chrome ore, so we mine the most, but the largest reserves are in Kazakhstan. And what we saw was an increase in Chinese investment in chrome ore mines in Kazakhstan. So I think these are complicated problems to solve. And perhaps just a final comment on that part of it. Beneficiation is just manufacturing. That's what it is. And all of the requirements for manufacturing apply to beneficiation as well. All you do is you reduce the cost of moving the rock to wherever the factory is. But then if you move the factory closer to the mine, which is what you're trying to do there, the cost of production rises. Otherwise, people would have located the factory near to the mine. So it's, the evidence I've looked at, which is fairly substantial, is in the long term, these processes don't work anywhere near as well as advertised on the label. So I'm trying to keep it short, so I'll just shut up there.
And thanks for that. Really appreciate it. We have a couple of other questions. It's a tough one, right? The one about whether we should not be smarter about our own tariffs in the Trump era. And I think the issue there being that Trump is likely to raise tariffs in the US as part of his trade policy, and that shouldn't we also apply our tariffs in a smarter way rather than eliminating them completely? Who wants to try and tackle that?
Maybe I'll just give a quick point.
Oh.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think firstly, I don't think anyone is talking about totally eliminating tariffs. I think that's a false or an incorrect interpretation, at least of the presentations that I've heard. And it's a false context of the discussion around exporting. I think Donald spoke about removing tariffs on goods that we do not produce. And so I think it's important just to set that context straight. It's not about liberalization. It's not about removing tariffs completely. It's the stories about export. So I think that's important to set the context. The Trump issue is a massive concern because in many reasons it's uncertain. The increase in tariffs can occur. And for us, the particular issue is whether it would affect, for example, our GOA access and whether he shifts that. And so government needs to be smarter. You're right, in terms of building links with the government and appealing to Trump so that he doesn't remove our access to GOA. And that's a job for our president to deal with. So that's the smarter aspect. The second smarter aspect is to actually think carefully about our global markets, and it's a risk, the US, but we have a free trade area with the EU. And when we look at actually our access and utilization of the preferences into the EU, we're underutilizing those. So we have an agreement, but we don't fully realize the gains from that. And that's partly because we're not competitive on the export side. So Trump's tariffs are not going to affect that market access necessarily, although they could increase competition in those markets, which could be a danger. So again, the problem here is primarily on the supply side, our inability to compete in terms of our production side, rather than primarily the external constraints and barriers to our exports. But then also it links to the third issue about our new markets, and that's China and some of these new growing regions where we really want to build our linkages and improve market access. It turns out that the tariff barriers are not high on the advanced economies. The US tariffs are pretty low, actually. It's the tariffs on the emerging economies that are very high. Outside of Africa, we don't seem to have a strategy yet of gaining market access into those economies through improved and reduced tariff access. So this links to the external policy strategy to open up those markets through expanding trade agreements and so on. And I think that's the smart part of the smart solution that needs to be adopted.
Excellent, thank you. And this one's for you, and so you can't judge this one. It's by Budisika. You say competitiveness must be the only criteria. How do you define competitiveness, and does it consider new entrants or entrants to the markets to enable transformation? And
yes, That's an important question. We think that in a more competitive economy where it will make it much easier for entrants to get into particular sectors of our economy or value chains. So that's exactly what we're saying, that the master plan approach tends to favor the big guys in the room. It favors the status quo, the people with the loudest voices, with the most money to have lobbyists going to Pretoria, whereas small and new firms don't have all of that. And we're saying we've got to make sure that the rules of the game in South Africa are much more open to new entrants. So I couldn't agree more. And we've got to make sure that the obstacles that firms face in the country are removed, because that will also encourage and assist new entrants into our economy. So the whole thrust of what we're saying is for a much more dynamic, open economy where the cost of doing business in South Africa comes down, and that will only help. Well, it will help all firms, but it will also help new firms and Black initiated firms as well. So that's the whole point. We don't want to preserve the status quo. We want to make the economy much more dynamic. So there are more and more and more opportunities for new firms to come up. And those will inevitably help transform who owns the South African economy.
Great stuff. There are other comments that you may want to comment on in your closing remarks, but just in terms of questions, moving along, a question from a friend and former colleague of mine, Fuad Kasim. How will the trend towards protectionism impact on localization? All right, who wants to take that? We haven't heard from you, Liberty. Do you want to tackle this one?
I can certainly give my 2 cents, but I am an expert in competition.
Go for it. Not a problem.
And not everything else.
Yes.
So, look, for me, there is one thing to say about localization, and we do want small firms. We do want localization to develop goods so that we can export those goods externally. So the question is, what are we exporting to world markets? But we want rivalry. So it's not just localization for the sake of it. It's localization that brings efficient firms who can then help us export value goods to world markets so that we are externally competitive. And that's my 2 or 1 cent, Khulekani, on this topic.
Yeah, thanks. That's not 1 cent. It is absolutely valuable insights. Thank you for them. And moving right along, there's a question here from let me just get the name, from Heinz Frank, which is in relation to the review of the automotive program. He wants clarity on the rationale. Has recent evidence pointed to the program being a drain on the fiscus? Because Professor Edwards does highlight that automotive exports previously has been an exception to export drag. Did something fundamentally change? I will say that in the full report, which you now have access to because a link has been provided, you will be able to get a little bit more on what that recommendation is based. But in the few minutes that we still have, let me see who wants to take this. I suspect that you're cited here, Professor Edwards. You may want to defend your honor. And if you want to also just elaborate on this in a minute each. Thanks.
So I just posed the data, but Donald has looked more closely at this particular issue, and he should comment as well as Anne.
Cool. Donald, do you want to go for it?
Sure. Well, I think what we do know is we spend an inordinate amount of money to pay companies to make cars here, and despite being subsidized, we pay a significant premium on cars. Those are not really disputable facts. The question is not whether we export a lot, but whether the cost of exporting those products exceeds the benefit that we get. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I don't think anyone else does either. And I think if you're going to be spending that much money on a particular program, which employs somewhere in the order of just over 100,000 people, you've got to ask yourself, is that money being well spent? What else could you do with 35 billion rand a year that may be able to create better outcomes? So, I'm not suggesting we take away the program, but I am saying an independent review is critical to understand what the net benefit actually is. I agree with Ann's earlier comment. The auto industry must be involved. Of course, government must be involved, but it has to be performed by somebody who doesn't have a vested interest in banking more cash.
Great. Thanks, Donald. And I'll hand over to Ann very shortly for her closing remarks, but just to bring this one question and ask Liberty to respond in 1 minute. Sipo Shoisa says, is the aggressive adoption of the special economic zone strategy and Invest SA instruments not enough for national promotion of competition to our shores as a form of competitiveness-focused approach? The only difference from your proposal to what we are already doing is transformational approach that has been adopted. So here's a question. Is this not enough?
Let me pass this one to the other panelists.
I'll deal with it.
Okay. So I will deal with it. Let me then at this point thank my panelists who were really excellent in sharing their perspectives on the subject matter at hand that was presented to us by Ann. From my perspective, there is a lot that we ought to chew on here and think deeply about as we move forward in terms of our trade and industrial policy, and whether we are getting the results that we want, whether we are getting the results that our economy so desperately needs, which is growth and jobs. So there should be no holy cows. We should really use this opportunity to ask the tough questions, to open up the debate, and to relook at our policies. And with that, let me hand over to Ann to make her closing remarks, including addressing this question. Thank you, Ann. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Want to make two substantial points. The first is we are calling for a review of the auto industry. One of the issues we're saying we need to know what the facts are and that it's really important to take all the costs into account. So as I said, it's 35 billion every year. And then it is also the fact that cars in South Africa are more expensive than we sell them into the export market. And you need to think about the costs that has in a country like ours with a history of spatial apartheid. It has enormous implications and cost implications for the rest of the economy. Now, we don't have those numbers, but we need to get them. So evidence-based policy review is what we're calling for, and that all costs and benefits need to be taken into account. And Lawrence's point that big changes in an economy need to be done carefully and managed strategically. So that's the first point. The second point is I think a lot of people might misunderstand the use of localization. CDE is in favor of expanding the South African economy. We want more South African firms, as many as possible of all different kinds. So in that sense, we're in favor of an expanding local economy. What we're opposed to is government departments being forced to buy local. That doesn't make sense to us, and that's a big thrust of our report, which I hope all of you will read. So they're very different issues here, and there's a sort of common usage of local and the government's policy of localization, which has been supported by NEDLAC, which we also think is misconstrued. So we have 2 reports on the localization policy. If you go to our website, you will see one on the 7 sins of localization, but there is another one as well. The third point I would make is that CDE will be bringing out a special report on SEZs and how we see SEZs and the contribution that they can make to South Africa. So if we can hold that debate until we launch that report. Other than that, just to thank the panel very much and to thank all of you for attending and to thank Khulekani for chairing this event for CDE. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.